This week, we're going to be asking ourselves, how do pandemics impact and reshape the way that societies are organized? In other words, how do pandemics reshape society? We're going to start with the Black Death, and then towards the end of the week, we're going to be looking at how might COVID-19 reshape our own society, the way we live and work and play every day. The Black Death, happening 7 centuries ago, is a historical record. It's left us artifacts that help us to answer that question because we're looking back instead of predicting the future, right? We're going to use a strategy called the 4-read strategy, where you go through the text 4 times. Only one of those 4 times are you truly reading for comprehension. The other times you're skimming through the document, looking for vocabulary, breaking it into sections and looking for the claims in each section. And then you're going to dig in and do what's called reading for dinner. Reading for vocabulary is the first read. You skim through the text to find words that are either important or unfamiliar. You're going to highlight them, look up the definition, especially if it's critical to understanding that section, and then write the definition in the margin so that when you really dig in, you do that reading for dinner, you can quickly reference the definition and fit that into the section so that it makes sense. If you were doing this in a textbook and you're unable to write in the margin, you can use Post-its to write the definition so they can be pulled out later. The second read is where you're going to chunk the information into sections. So section off the reading by main idea, using a highlighter or a pen to create section breaks and writing the topic of the section in the margin or on a Post-it. Remember that sections are not necessarily paragraphs. Sometimes there'll be multiple paragraphs on one specific topic or main idea, and all of them will fit into one section. Look for subheadings, just like you see right now on your page. The number 2, read for sections and claims, is a subheading. You would consider this its own section with its own main idea. The third read is that one we were calling read for dinner. Consider it dinner with the author. It gives you, as the reader, a chance to interact with the text and converse with the author. Although this read is most beneficial if you've read a number of other articles and authors that you can converse with all together, it can still be accomplished with the first article you read. As you read each section, you want to be asking the following questions. And remember, it's per section, not per paragraph. What does this section say? What does it mean? Why is it so important? Do I agree with this or disagree? Would other authors or articles, experts on this subject, agree or disagree? This allows you to begin to synthesize the information and analyze concepts, connect ideas to other readings or your prior knowledge, things you've already learned or read, and create your own personal stance on the topic. The purpose of the 4th read is for an assignment. If you've been asked to answer questions or write a short essay, this is when you're now going back to say, which pieces am I going to use to complete the assignment? Either finding the direct answers, or if it's an essay, which pieces are you going to pull out to cite, to reference back to strengthen the claims you're making in your own essay. A lot of times students will skip the read for dinner, that 3rd read, and go right to this. The trouble is, it's really hard to understand what's important if you haven't done that 3rd read, right? If you jump right into what's the answer, you might not be able to get the answer if you haven't gone through each section and said, what is this saying and why is it important? For today, we're going to use this strategy to look at an article called 10 Good Things We Owe to the Black Death. This week, we're going to focus on 3 specific areas of society that pandemics tend to reshape: healthcare and medicine, architecture and city structures, and social classes and social hierarchies. Keep that in mind as we go through this article today, looking for how the Black Death reshaped those 3 areas of European society. Using our 4-read strategy, the first read says to go through the article and highlight or underline unfamiliar or important looking vocabulary, then define it in the margins. You see, for time, because I'm looking out for you all, I've gone through and done this a little bit for us. I have circled gene variants, underlined beneficial genes, circled descendants, and autoimmune disorders. On the next page, I have circled hospitals were religious institutions, but maybe you want to circle just religious institutions. I've circled medieval hospitals to make sure I know what medieval is describing there. I've also circled almshouses, and maybe you would then also circle pensionaries if that is not a familiar word. In the paragraph towards the bottom of the page, I've circled arrest, because if you look at that sentence, the word arrest is being used in a way that is maybe unfamiliar, where the sentence says, the failure of traditional medicine to arrest the plague was analyzed and discussed. Towards the bottom of the page, I have circled specialized, dearth, flamboyant, and ostentatious. Remember that when you come across words like ostentatious, you can also look up how to pronounce them. And a lot of dictionaries will have a little icon, a speaker, that you can press to hear it said out loud. And remember that sometimes you may have heard these words before. It may not be that you've never heard the word before. You maybe have never heard latrine, but you've probably heard middle class. However, if you've never looked up the definition or couldn't define it out loud to yourself right now, you probably want to look up a definition to really help solidify your understanding so that the rest of the section will really make sense. Back on the first page here, now what we would do is go through and in the margins, right over here, we would write the definition of each one of the terms that we circled. You can also do this by writing it in your notebook. I'm not going to go through that now, only because it will make this a much longer Edpuzzle than most of you will be willing to do. However, it is a really good idea, and I probably will pause throughout the Edpuzzle to ask you for a definition to get you in the practice of looking them up. The second read said to read for sections, and this one's pretty easy, right? In this article, so far, we've kind of seen that they're broken into these different subheadings. However, be careful, because remember that we said the 3 sections we're looking for, the 3 topics we're interested in, are how the Black Death impacted healthcare and medicine, architecture and city planning, and social classes or social hierarchies. So we're going to want to group these sections to fall under these 3 headings of our own in our own notes, right? So first we have healthier people, and that's going to go along with our number 1, healthcare and medicine. So I might put number 1 next to it, and maybe I even circle it so it really stands out. You could also grab a highlighter, and I recommend making each section its own color. So maybe we're going to use green for this one. And we grab our highlighters, and maybe I'm going to highlight that heading in green, healthier people. Now, if I see another heading that fits under healthcare and medicine, I'm not going to label it a new section, I'm going to label it as part of number 1. So let's take our sticky note with us. As we skim down, we notice all these paragraphs are under that same section, so this is all still under number 1. When we move to the next page, the next heading says hospitals. Looking at our sticky note, which section are we going to label this subheading hospitals? 1, 2, or 3? Very good. It's still number 1. So in the margin, I'm writing a number 1. Like I said, I might circle it so it really stands out if I'm skimming back through. And I'm going to highlight it in that same green color. Now we come down to a new section, and it says more functional homes. Which section do you think the subheading more functional homes fits under? 1, 2, or 3? Very good. This is a new section. We're going to call it number 2, put a circle around that, and then maybe I'm going to choose a different color for highlighting more functional homes. So that when I look at this page and I see hospitals in green at the top, once I see the new color, I know I'm onto a new section in my notes. Then we see the end of feudalism, and if we've defined feudalism in our first read, we know that it's a class structure. So we're going to label this number 3, because this is going to fit under social class and social hierarchies. We've used green, we've used orange. Maybe now we're going to use a pink color to talk about this section, or to highlight this section, which is really going under social class and social hierarchy. This is really still the same section. It's still number 3. It's still social class and social hierarchy, so we'll highlight it that same color. Sometimes what I'll do is even kind of draw a bracket to remind myself that this is all the same topic. This is all under the same subheading. Now we're on to our third read, and today we're going to combine the third and fourth reads, the read for dinner and the read for assignment, because you're doing your assignment as you go, answering questions. When you read for dinner, remember that you are analyzing each section. You should be asking yourself, what is this section telling me? What does it say? What does this mean? Why is it important? Do I agree with this? And do I think that other people, experts on the same topic, would also agree with the way the author is interpreting the history here? Let's read for dinner. 10 good things we owe to the Black Death. Yersinia pestis. Who would think that such a microscopic organism in the gut of an infected flea could create an upheaval in human society? The Black Death, tragic though it was, may have made the world a brighter place. The following improvements to society would no doubt have inevitably evolved gradually, but the Black Death was a catalyst. In spearheading change, it allowed humanity to benefit from the new circumstances sooner than later. Number 1, healthier people. Human populations evolve when confronted with disease. Gene variants help certain people fight infection better than those who do not have those variants. People with these beneficial genes tend to bear more children than those who don't. This process, known as positive selection, results in favored genes persisting over time while inferior genes die out. Recent studies have found that descendants of Europeans who survived the plague had their genes altered to make them more resistant to disease. It may explain why Europeans respond differently from other people to certain illnesses and autoimmune disorders. More specifically, a cluster of 3 immune system genes code proteins that latch onto harmful bacteria, triggering a defensive response. People living in places that Black Death did not ravage lack these toll receptor-like genes. The Black Death may have been a gigantic laboratory for natural selection to weed out the weak and frail from the population. An analysis of skeletal remains in a London churchyard revealed that people after the plague had a much lower risk of dying at any age than those who lived before. Before the plague, only 10% of the population could expect to live past 70. Post-plague, that figure had risen to 20%. This reshaping of human biology, coupled with the better diets available after the pestilence, allowed post-plague Europeans to be more resilient and thus live longer. As the adage goes, what doesn't kill you will make you stronger. Continuing with section number 1, hospitals. Before the Black Death, hospitals were simply places where the sick were isolated so they would not infect others. A critically ill person entering a medieval hospital was a hopeless case. All that the hospital could do was dispose of whatever property the unfortunate wretch had and say a mass for his soul. In fact, these hospitals took more care of one's soul than one's body, since disease and sickness were regarded as punishments from sin. Indeed, hospitals were religious institutions where the patient's treatment regimen were confession and prayer. The Mass was the central aspect of hospital life. Medieval hospitals had no professional doctors or nurses and were staffed by monks and nuns. Curing the sick physically, though practiced, was not high on the agenda and largely consisted of herbal concoctions. Hospitals also functioned as almshouses and pensionaries, taking in widows, orphans, guests, and travelers. The word hospitality shares the same Latin root as hospital. The Great Pestilence jump-started the transformation of the hospital from a charity endeavor to a place where the sick go for treatment. With so many stricken by the disease, hospitals were forced to give up their multiple functions as way stations and hospices so that they could concentrate on the sick and dying. Simultaneously, there were important changes in medical practice. The failure of traditional medicine to arrest the plague was analyzed and discussed, and new ideas were put forward. Medicine ceased to be theoretical and text-bound and became more observational and practical. Anatomy and surgery became parts of the medical program in universities. From being a quaint philosophy, medicine evolved into a practical physical science. With professional doctors becoming more central to a hospital's operations, medical services were specialized, and there arose hospitals or wards devoted to different categories of illnesses. Section number 2, more functional homes. The dearth of skilled artisans and builders after the plague forced architects to strive for simpler building designs. English churches, for example, moved away from the flamboyant, decorated Gothic to the less ostentatious perpendicular Gothic style, so called because of its emphasis on vertical lines. The new style allowed for more immense windows, giving stained glass craftsmen greater scope for creativity. There was also an increased demand for private spaces in domestic architecture, perhaps a reaction to the pre-plague crowding that had enabled the disease to spread rapidly. House plans in the pre-plague world consisted of a hall, which was a single room open to the roof timbers with an open hearth. Here, the family lived communally and received their guests. Poorer folks lived in timber houses with wattle and daub panels and thatched roofs that offered little protection from rats and other vermin. But by the late 14th and early 15th centuries, the hall was being divided by partition walls on one or both ends. This separated the occupants from servants, animals, and the dirt of the streets. Sometimes these end sections were further divided into a lower chamber or parlor and an upper solarium. At Bodiam Castle, private rooms even had their own latrines. The use of rushes to cover the floor, which were breeding grounds for vermin, was abandoned in favor of carpets and rugs. Private homes became more luxurious and comfortable. Section number 3. End of feudalism. Before the plague, the feudal system rigidly divided the population in a caste system, with the king at the top, followed by nobles and wealthy merchants, and the peasants or serfs at the bottom. Before the plague, the king was thought to own all the land which he allocated to his nobles. The nobles had serfs work the land, which turned a profit for the lord, who paid a percentage to the king. The serfs themselves earned nothing for their labor except lodging and food they grew themselves. Since all land was the king's, he felt free to give it as gifts to friends, relatives, and other nobility who had been of service to him. And so every available piece of land, by about 1347, was being cultivated by serfs under one of these lords. Europe was severely overpopulated at this time, and so there was no shortage of serfs to work the land. And these peasants had no choice but to continue this labor, which was in essence a kind of slavery, from the time they could walk until their death. There was no upward mobility in the feudal system, and a serf was tied to the land he and his family worked from generation to generation. As the plague wore on, however, depopulation greatly reduced the workforce, and the serf's labor suddenly became an important and increasingly rare asset. The lord of an estate could not feed himself, his family, or pay tithes to the king or the church without the labor of his peasants. And the loss of so many meant that survivors could now negotiate for better pay and better treatment. The lives of the members of the lowest class vastly improved as they were able to afford better living conditions and clothing, as well as luxury items. Once the plague had passed, the improved lot of the serf was challenged by the upper class, who were concerned that the lower classes were forgetting their place. Fashion changed dramatically as the elite demanded more extravagant clothing and accessories to distance themselves from the poor, who could now afford to dress more finely than in their previous rags and blankets. Efforts of the wealthy to return the serf to his previous condition resulted in uprisings and peasant revolts. There was no turning back, however, and the efforts of the elite were futile. Class struggle would continue, but the authority of the feudal system was broken. Continuing with section number 3, the middle class. Freedom from feudal obligations gave many peasants a glimpse of wider horizons beyond their village. More ambitious peasants were lit with a sense of purpose and flocked into cities to engage in crafts and trades. The more successful ones became wealthy. They became a new middle class. Cities became a hive of activity as the economy, now firmly on a cash basis, took off. The roots of the capitalist system had emerged. With more disposable income, the new rich could afford more of the luxuries that could be obtained in the East. The traffic between East and West stimulated trade and an increase in merchants and traders. Eastern ideas, especially from the Muslim world, flowed into Europe, stimulating a rise in learning. Townspeople became so affluent that they rivaled the old landowning nobility. The gentry didn't like the competition, and in a sumptuary law passed in 1363, they forbade merchants and their families from wearing cloths of gold, silver, or silk, or from adorning themselves with jewels or fur. Aside from investing in personal luxuries, the middle class used their wealth to become patrons of the arts, science, literature, and philosophy. The result was an explosion of cultural and intellectual creativity we now call the Renaissance.